Hello and welcome to August's Nomensa webinar, hosted by our Head of Design, Wellesley-Davies. Today's webinar, called Build Trust and Commercial Value with a Localised Government Design System, will share insight from design research and experience about how to design systems and standards to become an extension of your brand identity, project your culture, and personality, and match the tone and sensitivity of different service requirements. Today, we'll share practical steps to improve advocacy with stakeholders and develop a common vision that works for both your team and your customers. First of all, though, before I get into the housekeeping, I'm delighted to say that we'll be soon launching our councils and local government community. And that's going to be kicking off with a free virtual roundtable in November. This is going to be a great opportunity to share knowledge, best practice, and common challenges. So if you're part of a local government organisation looking to improve your digital service offering, please do let us know either on our social channels or drop us an email at hello@nomensa.com. We'll make sure you get an invite to that. Finally, our September webinar is also now live, which is titled Google is a User, Change My Mind. And that's hosted by our Senior Experience Optimization Consultant, Peter Kay. That's live now on Eventbrite, so you can register for free over there. Onto today's webinar though, please say hello to each other in the chat. Make sure your chat settings are switched to panelists and attendees so that everyone can see your messages. And do let us know if there's any issues with the stream. Also, please submit your questions using the Q&A box. I'll get through as many as I can with these with Will at the end. And finally, we're using auto-generated captions. Some of these might not be 100% accurate, but we will make sure the transcripts are kind of accurate and up to date when this goes live on our YouTube channel. So yeah, without further ado, I will hand over to you, Will.
Thank you very much. Well, today I'm going to be sharing some of our insights and learnings from our experiences working with gov.uk design systems and how we've sort of adapted them to the local needs of different organisations, both sort of national and sort of local government services. And the first thing to really think about design systems is we need to understand the sort of process of localising them. And to do that, we need to understand a little bit more about how we respond to design systems. We need to understand how they work, but also what sort of relationship we have with them. And that's from different perspectives. It's from the perspective of designers. It's from the perspective of service owners and sort of editors and authors. And it's also from the perspective of our customers. So they're quite complicated, but equally fascinating kind of systems to start understanding. I'm going to start with this sort of statement, which is from Susan Whitmore. She's a professor of psychology, and she makes that statement, why the look on your face may matter more than what you say, and follows it up with this question of, will people trust you? The answer is written all over your face. And I think what she's trying to explain is not just to sort of help us feel a little bit shallow, but actually just to help us understand how we process information, and that we process visible information much quicker than we can other information. So that the information we're receiving visually starts to shape and frame how we then understand the next part of the information. What we find is that we then make an assumption. We make a hypothesis of a situation based on the visual stuff, and then we validate it with what happens afterwards. This is a bit like everybody attending this session today. It's flattering to me, people have booked the event, and in that way, I then feel that you have instilled your trust in me to share my experiences. And it's this sort of area of trust and the perception that has fascinated me in my role in design. How we create moments of both persuasion and trust is very much what design is all about. And often that can cause some friction, and not least when we start to move into sort of responsible government services that come with a different standard of responsibility. So for many years, design has been also quite a specialist subject. It's been quite a closed discipline. It's very much the reveal, the magic at the end of the process. But increasingly over the last several years, we found that actually some of this sort of process is beginning to become open up. And we've begun to share a lot more about how we design, and we're beginning to design in a much more collaborative way. And what I've been learning as we've been developing this new way of working together is a number of themes that are constant and they are part of design. So design is dealing with technology, and technology always changes. Design standards always need to keep up to date with users' expectations. The goalposts are always moving, in effect. A big part of design is also collaboration, the activity of working together with different informers, people with specialist knowledge, specialist skills is all part of a design system coming to fruition. And all of this is a process that requires trust. We need to trust our colleagues, our contributors to the process, to help develop a system that can then work for everyone. So when we start looking at trust, in a sort of psychological term, we look at trust as a belief that we instill in a person. It's what we expect of them. And when I was doing some research for this talk, I came across some of the work that Baroness Honora O'Neill does. She's a philosopher who talks about quite a lot about the role of trust in sort of the accountability in public life. And very interestingly, she sort of raises this topic of trust, and people don't trust enough. And she turns it around and talks about, well, what about, are you trustworthy? And I thought this was quite an interesting aspect in relationship to designing localized design systems. It's about establishing a trustworthy system. And therefore, how do we develop services that are trustworthy is really what we're trying to achieve. And O'Neill breaks down sort of trustworthiness in terms of these sort of three factors from a philosopher's view, in terms of it needs to demonstrate competence, we need to demonstrate honesty and reliability. And then when you parallel that with some of the four factors of trust in experience design, which the Nielsen-Norman group have come up with, we can see some really interesting sort of parallels that start to break down that sort of philosopher's view, the psychology understanding, into some quite practical design kind of skills. So when we look at the quality of design against our competence, it's about demonstrating clear and meaningful navigation. It's about easily scannable content and layouts, usable, accessible functionality, and having sort of a professional kind of appeal to the visual design. When we look at honesty, it seems to parallel with sort of being more upfront in our disclosure, explaining the whole process. It's important in services that we can explain all the steps involved without missing one out. People don't appreciate missing information, they become skeptical. And moving down, we've got sort of content being comprehensive. It's important that information is both up to date, it's relevant, and therefore it gives a different sense of understanding. It gives you a kind of clearer sense that this information is what information I can trust. And with that, using connections to other channels like social media is another aspect to show not just an honesty, but also a kind of reliability aspect in terms of having connections to other channels. Gives people that sense of security that they can turn to another channel if they choose. But also using some social channels shows a degree of sort of vulnerability. It allows you to sort of have your services reaching out into conversational channels. So what we understand is that customers are always kind of evaluating. They're always checking whether they can believe what you're saying and whether they should trust your services. So we can see this in, sorry, my slides didn't update as I expected. So we can see this actually being put into practice in the commercial world all around us. These two examples I've got here, IKEA and McDonald's, hugely successful companies that at their very heart, they take the customer experience central to their sort of proposition. They deliver a consistent experience in all their stores. They're kind of constantly kind of reinventing and inspiring, but delivering a kind of reassurance of consistency as well. They're often well connected with the locations that they operate in. They demonstrate some of the best practices of customer service, and they're constantly evolving. And it's interesting with these two examples I've shown you in that they are franchise businesses. These are businesses based on a design system, in a way, a model that can be then applied into different regions, different localities, and then adapted to ensure their commercial success. So let's turn and look at the gov.uk design system and just understand some of the value that that brings to the table in helping design a localized design system. This was developed back in 2018, I think, and as an outcome, it was out of developing the gov.uk website, the design team built up a design system to sort of build a more efficient and effective service. And they decided to then turn that into a more accessible format and share it so people could benefit from those learnings. And so out of the box, it provides a brilliant sort of model of best practice. It demonstrates excellent standards of accessibility and usability. It's an incredibly reassuring sort of robust service in that it has been extremely highly tested and validated with millions of customers through the sort of different national exposure it's had. And it provides a wonderful living system of very common and functional components. And it's broken down into these sort of 4 sections. I mean, you've got your styles that help deliver kind of colors and fonts and sort of spacing that helps build a kind of holistic sort of fabric to the designs. You have your kind of functional components, the kind of incremental pieces of functionality. And then you have patterns which build together kind of combinations of those components that sort of build up kind of common tasks, whether it's a kind of payment details or whether it's capturing your address details. And then it has the combinations of patterns that can build out page templates. And so for a lot of common kind of government related services, there are many, many common sort of design patterns that are going to be useful, and they build up a kind of baseline of your kind of design system. But it's worth considering some of the pros and cons. And so when we look at the experience value of, let's say, the gov.uk design system, we're beginning to evaluate it on a couple of different levels. So on one level, these are the 7 factors of experience design. They're quite commonly recognized. And at the top, you've got the sort of usefulness, the usability, the findability. These are very functional, utilitarian kind of qualities that the gov.uk design system supports really, really well. But as we start to move into credibility, desirability, and valuable, they become a little bit more distant in terms of they require more contributions from content and some other design to help that really resonate in a more local context. And another good way of putting that into some context in a kind of visual way is if we think about user journeys traveling sort of up and down, up being the sort of more challenging tasks and down being where I've learned something and it gets easier. These kind of peaks represent a nice sort of challenge where for the majority of the activities that customers have to do, that they already know how to do something. The best practice is put in place and then they know how to do it. But there are always going to be those points where we move across that dotted line where things start to become a little bit more, require a bit more effort. And with that, we want to start to use more creative, more inspiring aspects of design to try and motivate people. Sometimes it might be a pull, sometimes it might be a push, but every design system can accommodate a little bit of room to support a little bit more sort of push and pull capability that can sometimes be something that a particular editor or an author can have some control of, but it can support those different types of journeys. And I should credit actually Tim Poole, he's the head of design at the GDS design team. He shared a similar post actually about forms and the sort of effort of forms on top of a service. And I took inspiration from this, but it becomes quite a useful metaphor that we can kind of remember as we move through. So when we look at localizing design systems, I've broken it down into sort of 3 phases. The first phase is to evaluate. That is you need to understand how your organization designs. A design system is to integrate. It's a system that needs to work with people and for people. And therefore you need to evaluate and understand how your organization designs. And I'll walk through a couple of practical steps and some examples that we've done that show you some of the outputs from that. The next is to co-design. I think once you've understood your requirements and the sort of context and needs of your design system, you do need to design it together as a team. You need to work with your kind of product and service owners, work with design and development teams, and work with your customers, with your users, to sort of reassure and validate that you're taking the right steps. Because you want to design a system that will work in a practical sense. And build as a product. The sort of statement in that is that a design system needs to live and breathe. It needs to evolve. The value of a design system improves over time. And you want to build a system that can be set up for success. You will have all the aspirations to include an awful lot of functionality in a design system. And for all the sort of normal realities, they will have to be prioritized. And you may not get them all done, but you want to build a sort of setup of a system that will allow you to progress and continue that journey throughout the life of the design system. So when we look at evaluates, what we're really asking is, how do we use design to deliver services? And it's really, that's like a cheesy term, looking at it from a sort of helicopter view, but it's about stepping out and looking at your organization and think, well, where does design kind of support all our services? That will involve your design teams, your communication teams, your marketing. You will have resources, governance, but you will have different types of channels, whether it's social media, print media, phone systems, etc. These are different channels which might interpret the design in different ways. But what we're trying to do here is understand, what do customers see? How do they experience the services when they pick up the phone to order a new bin and are asked to go online, or they respond to a letter? We want to build that understanding of the visual language, the tone of voice, the style of service, and what expectations that sets. And one of the best things to do is to set out some design research. Design research is a means to reach out to the different teams and gather information. And this is an example we did with Brent Borough in London. We worked with their different sort of stakeholders to see how they used print media in magazines and sort of the way the style of those worked, how they used sort of interactions with some of the sort of central government services. We looked at the way they presented their brand in different channels, and we learned along the way the kind of culture of their community and some of the dynamics and the challenges of that area. We can also begin to look at things in a more granular and specifically targeted way. So one of the good, interesting and useful tasks is to do an audit, looking at the specific usability, the UI components and content. And quite often, councils are looking at a design system to solve a consolidation problem, in terms of they've got sites that have been developed at different times for different reasons. And that with that, there is a range of qualities of service. And when we worked with Walsall Council, that was exactly the situation they were in. Quite justified. Councils over a period of maybe 10 years have actually built up different levels and layers of capability and technologies. And it was important to understand, what did they look like? What impression would that give to customers? What experience does that give? And we can break down some of the components, some of the material used, and the sort of build out some of almost the requirements a design system needs to include. And with this, we can begin to assess things like accessibility. We can identify and pinpoint points where there's failure, whether it's technology that sort of a design's become too out of date to properly render on different mobile devices, or whether governance and sort of design resources have sort of run out of steam in terms of, they're using the same icon for 4 things. And clearly these are things which are often things we don't want to sort of blame, but it's a case of understanding what the challenge is and how we can then develop a system that can help support resolving them. There's just another example. We were working with Cornwall Council, and again, it was just looking at multiple components, and that begins to help inform how we can then prioritize the types of components we want to build in a design system. Another area we want to look at is most local authorities have a brand, an identity, and it will often have its own design kind of guidelines, its visual corporate identity. But often these are often fixed in time. This is an example from Warsaw. I think it was about 10 years old when we were shown it. And often design teams know this. It's a case of interpreting, but it's a good opportunity to take stock of how your brand identity has been set up, what the design governance is around it, and how you can kind of understand the gap between what kind of governance you have, what your customers need now, and what type of design guidance can we provide in a digital context. Quite often in these sort of design guidelines, they're simply not up to date with the sort of WCAG accessibility guidelines, or for sort of the multiple responsive device type of digital applications that customers expect. Another aspect, so I won't go into too much detail, but clearly getting a view from your customers, from your users, or from your staff is important to establish a kind of benchmark of what the challenges are and the expectations. And we can do that in two different kind of ways in a research capacity, whether it's quantitative or qualitative. You know, we can either ask, roll out surveys or do task analysis against kind of current systems to understand how difficult or what people's sort of broad opinions are, or we can do quite kind of specific interviews where we can do kind of one-to-one interviews, we can do usability testing and get a much richer sort of sense of feedback from customers. And that can provide really valuable kind of benchmarking of the sort of standards of services you have and the expectations. And it can also help strengthen business cases as you kind of progress with the development of maybe funding. And once you have this wealth of design research, the most important thing is to then come together with a broad set of stakeholders that represent the different teams that have a play in the actual practice and delivery of design and sort of development, copywriting, content development, and service design, so that we can kind of have that conversation and understand a little bit of the history of where you've come from and got to, what the expectations are. It gives you a great understanding of seeing the real challenges that your customers can have. And I think having that sort of discussion in the open is very positive in terms of building relationships to contribute into the requirements for the new design system. So the next stage is co-design. The question we're asking really is, how do we use design to serve our community? So the main thing we're going to set up here is setting up requirements. The first step is some of the practical requirements. The GovUK Design Service creates a set of standards that we can take on board. We've got the WCAG guidelines to inform from their perspectives. And then we might have practical steps which can vary in terms of using additional kind of design frameworks that might assist developing systems and designs that are responsive, that can work quickly and efficiently across different devices. You might also use different design frameworks to support a content management system or a sort of technology you want to integrate with. But these become clear kind of dependencies and influences that we need to understand how they play a part, and they pull in different kind of ways. So it's important to sort of try and define those relationships up front, and that can give you some sensible, practical kind of constraints to then work and design a solution. So as we talked about with brand guidelines, once we've defined some of the standards against accessibility, we can begin to identify how to take some of those brand colors and do tests, some tests you can do in terms of checking the accessibility in the way those colors work on different backgrounds. So for Warsaw, on the right, you can see the sort of Gov design system colors, and beneath you can see the Warsaw color palette, where we then start to tweak those colors and we calibrate it so that they start to meet the accessibility standards. And then from that, we can then start to put that into some concept designs to start to see and show the council how the designs can work. And it's important, even in the early phases, to develop concept designs. I think a lot of the time, as I said at the beginning, design has in the past been a bit of secretive art. It's a sort of happens behind the curtains and then there's a reveal. But I think when designing a design system, the design system is a kind of working system. It needs to support different types of content, different types of services. It'll need to support to a greater degree a lot of the existing content. And in some of these early mood boards we put together for Warsaw, we decided to use some of their existing content to sort of pull into the new initial designs. And we were trying to show how might that color work on a header? How might those colors work in combination with some of the gov.uk color palettes for kind of interaction colors? How can we use some of those colors in a more accessible way to still define different types of spaces? Colors can provide quite a useful way to shift the mood and feel of a page or break content up. So it's important to show your workings as you develop the designs. Another key area, I think, with localizing is using these relationships you've built through the design research phases and the regular kind of meetings with stakeholders, is use that interaction between sort of counselors and design teams and service teams to learn about the area. When we worked with Warsaw, we learned a lot about some of the commercial objectives that the councillor wanted to achieve in terms of promoting it as a place to visit, but promoting the area as a place to be proud of. It's got this amazing art gallery and museums and a very rich and diverse sort of modern culture, but also with a very strong sort of heritage in manufacturing across 100 trades, I think they said. And this information and this type of conversational research and learning can be used to inspire design. So with Warsaw, we developed, one of the designers was inspired to think, well, we could create kind of like a tile system that responds to these 100 trades, whether it's buckles or belts or leather and stitching. There are all sorts of themes that seem to work quite nicely. And the designers could develop this lovely kind of tiled kind of texture, quite simple kind of designs, not overly complicated in terms of generating them, but quite easy to sort of play around with. And we thought we could bring this in as a kind of texture that could sit in the backgrounds. We could develop it as a coded illustration that you could then allow the developers and developing out the templates to change the colorways. So we're now adapting the brand colors to be accessible. We're using the heritage and understanding of the people and culture to bring into illustrative elements that can sit within the framing of the design. And that worked across into even the icons. We decided that we'd quite like to develop some bespoke icons that better reflected some of the diversity and changes in the culture of that area. And equally in the commercial sense, we could evolve this to sort of include some of the leisure activities so that the whole illustration becomes quite a playful and kind of delighting kind of experience for customers. And here are a couple of examples where we, again, worked with stakeholders to identify key challenges. So one of their challenges, they had a lot of leisure centres that want to really lift their ability to promote and manage better online services, whether it's booking, finding out opening times, creating memberships. But equally, we had others from the sort of SEND department, the sort of child services looking at helping improve the way they could communicate information through to young people, parents, and people with different types of educational needs. And therefore the tone and style wanted to adjust. And so working with these stakeholders, we could begin to really craft good examples of how the functional components that are part of the design system could be actually used in different ways for the different benefits of the different services. And this is a really good way to build advocacy across your team of stakeholders. Quite a lot of the time in design, it can be left to the kind of stakeholders to believe, but this is a good way of actually demonstrating how the designs work, how you can use the banner in different ways, whether it's simple, whether it's rich and diverse, whether it's in a particular color that represents a certain section. And I think it helps kind of build a different level of confidence from the team to understanding how the system can work. So this makes me think about when we look at design systems, how they support user journeys. And I like to sort of talk about these sort of micro moments. A design system is a kind of like a Lego kit of Lego bricks that you can kind of build up into different kind of different types of templates. But each of those Legos creates a little moment of sort of interest. And we can use the way we develop templates and the patterns within those templates to sort of stimulate and help the user along their journey. And this was just a little example put together where imagine someone looking to hire a room in a local library. Then it's using or demonstrating how illustration can draw people's attention to specific features you have. We can present clear information around strong visual communication of how an event space might look. And then we can switch between the inspiring and the utility, where people almost don't need to think about how it works. It just feels instinctive. And the functionality is instinctive. I can just see where the booking button is. I don't have to go off and hunt for it. All the contact information is collected in one place. All that contact information, it allows them to have this alternative channel in terms of I could call if I need to. And often we find in services that having those support systems means actually it helps people progress a little bit further in the digital sense, so it can help with that service efficiency. And just building in things like useful maps can help then extend the journey in terms of helping them sort of gather up some sort of instructions, or the sort of shareability of a function that might enable them to share this location with someone else and extend the value of the service as a whole. So when I've got another example working with Brent, we developed a design system for them in a kind of visual delivery. And with Brent, it's often dominated by Wembley. It's always known for Wembley. And yet there are all these other amazing locations and landmarks that the council was keen to sort of bring a bit more kind of balance to. And we designed for this one a series of these sort of landmark kind of illustrations that could be placed into the page at different points, and that we could organize them in different ways. So we could kind of create different types of compositions, and then the flow of the illustration just helped kind of create quite a fun and slightly more sort of exciting experience within the page. And this just helps create little moments of delight. So as you scroll through the news, you can sort of see a different combination of illustrations. If you go to the library, then you can see the library that's sort of picked out in that particular place. So it has this sort of ability to provide quite sort of hyper localization, and in some ways helps to provide quite a nice playful stimulus for users when they kind of join up the fact that they've seen that building on the high street 100 times and maybe hadn't realized it was the library, or just acknowledged the way it's been configured into the sort of illustration that builds the structures of the pages. Another factor as we talk about journeys is thinking about the kind of common journeys, the sort of the planned journeys, and then the spontaneous ones. Again, working with service design, it's a case of there are jobs to be done, and that people want to have confidence that people can find their way through and deliver an effective service. And so working with Brent, we developed quite a few quite low fidelity types of prototypes. We look at the functional components we're playing with from the GDS system, and we can map those into our prototype, and we could work through quite simple, 3, 4, 5 page steps. And we could set up tasks and do usability testing then, and have proper responses from kind of customers to see how they responded. And this is a really good way to sort of build confidence in the sort of service benefits that the design system can give. And prototypes is just also another way to share it with stakeholders and community groups if you have them. When we worked with Cornwall, we worked with, they have a kind of group of about 50 local residents that would feed into their sort of digital sort of reviews. And having a clickable prototype in a kind of cloud shared function was a really nice way for them just to have that sort of accessibility to the process. They could feel involved, and it provided some really useful insights to sort of help give the internal team confidence that they were doing the right things. And now we come to building as a product. A design system is not really a sort of fixed design that once finished, everyone walks away. It should be designed as something you want to manage long term. The value of a design system can build over time. And so the key question here is to sort of understanding how are we going to keep the system up to date. Translating sort of visual designs into the build, it's key to sort of, in all development processes, to sort of set up backlogs, clearly identify some of the functional components you need to develop, be clear about their acceptance criteria so you can evaluate them as they're built. And that can also support the way you document and share the sort of accessibility of your design system as you then build it in code. It's worth thinking here, as I mentioned, about the long-term value of design systems, is often there's a sort of a certain amount of investment up front, but actually once you've got a system up and running with the right understanding from that research, its value can reduce the cost of development quite substantially over the long run. And it also improves the speed of delivery. Once you've got a set of components ready to go and can be configured differently, you can actually build many more services much quicker, which can help with that kind of migration process and actually reduce some of the cost overall over time for developing it. But it means sometimes you need to think maybe at looking at different ways of funding the way that design system works. But it does open up that great value over time. Another way to sort of expand on that value and manage it as a product is when we're developing code, it's really useful. We've done this a couple of times now, is building code in these kind of containers, these sort of cloud containers, they're little websites that can then contain the design system and allow a very accessible way for other developers to have access to it. So if you're still working with third parties that want to replicate the sort of front end view of your design system, then using these types of tools allows us to bed in a documentation and explanation of why they're accessible, what's important to maintain. These are also live kind of working code, so you can see the components as they are, as wide as your browser. You can access the same tools on mobile and see how they behave on mobile. So they're a really good way for different types of stakeholders to see how the components work, but they're also great to share with third parties so that the styles, some of the components can be adopted across your services. And that can improve the connection between central government, local government, and sort of third-party services. And this brings me sort of full circle, really. I think the best thing about building a product is building a kind of culture around it. I think one of the best things we've worked with all our clients is the process of developing and fostering a culture of design across departments. It's sort of enabling everybody to be part of that process. I think we found that a lot of people get a lot of value from sharing that design journey with other people, just as I'm doing here. And you get great value of listening to other organizations. And I think the more open we are about how we design, what we think is important, then I think we can kind of overall improve the quality of government services. And so with that, I think that comes to the end of my talk, and open it up to questions.
Brilliant, thanks, Will. Yeah, such a useful and insightful presentation. Hope everyone watching found it useful too. If you have any questions for Will, please do submit them now. Well, I love the kind of collaborative approach to design here, and you can see that, you know, the value that's bringing. Well, you kind of mentioned these systems, are you kind of keeping these systems up to date and fresh and kind of treating the design system itself as a product? Kind of how often would you kind of look to review that and update, and kind of how would you manage that?
I think in practical terms, often when in the projects we've worked on, often the design process creates a kind of kit of wonderful Lego. But the reality is actually how you apply that system to your site and then migrate all your content is the other part of the mountain you need to climb. And I don't, you know, I'm not, you know, that in itself is its own challenge. But I think building in kind of regular cycles of review, 2 weekly cycles if you've got a development team, to kind of review how is that migration of content working within the design system. I think that's really important. And to sort of maybe open up sort of monthly sessions to sort of review at a wider level what sort of strategy is to sort of think what kind of investment needs to be made to pick up the challenges that you might be building as you migrate content. But I think it does need to be quite regular, but again, it depends on the way your organization's set up.
Brilliant. Thank you, Will. So we've got a question here in the chat from Vicky, who's asking if you kind of have any tips for kind of upfront disclosure that you mentioned at the start.
How do you mean in the research?
Yeah, I believe so. Yeah, if you'd like to.
I think the key thing when we kick off a project or the process, the initiative, as it were, to sort of design a design system, it's probably creating a culture of just openness. It's not about criticizing. It's not about finding fault. So I think it's good to have a core team that can then help orchestrate that kind of safe space to discuss and understand. I've worked with many big corporate companies and big tech companies who've had all the same problems. Things happen because things happen fast and they deal with the moment at the time. But often when people understand that, there doesn't have to be any animosity. But I think establishing that open kind of uncritical kind of culture is really key up front.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got a question here from Bob, who is asking, how would you approach governments to modify their websites to be more accessible?
I think with that, it's about understanding, coming back to the service design as well, it's looking at what are the barriers. We do hundreds of accessibility audits. So we can, as an agency, you can look at a specific service and sort of break it down into smaller slices and sort of say, well, with this specific service, what are the boundaries what are the issues around accessibility? And then you can then moderate what are the biggest issues and think about whether you can tackle them. Quite a lot of the time with things like accessibility, it can often be down to content. Without design systems are often trying to identify common challenges and then instill in those, so you cover the most amount of issues underneath, as it were. It doesn't necessarily get around content issues always. That's about sort of working practices and governance. But I think the first probably process with tackling accessibility is often trying to look at some of the fundamentals, the sort of structure of a page, the navigation, whether they're responsive, or whether the coding is correct. Sometimes that can cause an issue with different types of readers. So it can be a bit of a can of worms. But I think having a bit of an audit can help you understand the priorities and tackle the most important things first.
Brilliant. Thank you, Will. So we have a question here from Fraser. Fraser asks, do you have any recommendations as to what councils and local governments need to do to ensure design system decisions are followed across all of their teams?
Yeah. Well, I suppose that this is about kind of, we talk so often, a lot of people talk about content design, right? I think it's about governance of services. And I think one of the big things I'd like to see more is standards in service design, in terms of trying to set some broad kind of, I've forgotten the word now, guardrails, as it were, to try and ensure that some of the basics of your services are kind of following the same path. And that as you demonstrate it with one service, you can kind of then replicate it and build a sort of forum of individuals within your organization that can uphold that kind of standard of service design. It's a more modern kind of way of looking at it, I think, in terms of it's now becoming quite a specialist skill set. And certainly service design can start looking at the way services work from a kind of efficiency and optimization level. But from an experience level, I think it's also important to define what experience should people have, and what is the standard you set against all services. Often it can vary quite a lot. So I think it's a combination of having a willingness to set some standards and then support them with training and a kind of program to kind of see how you could kind of bring people on board. And so, when we talk about design systems, it's a way of trying to coordinate a consistency of approach, but that can also work into a consistency of how content is created and how services use that system. So it's a sort of extension of the same principles.
Thanks, Will. So I have a question here from Tristan. Tristan asks, how do you govern a design system that will be used on many platforms, for example, web, iOS, Android, as they obviously have some platform-specific differences?
Yeah, quite often this is a common problem with lots of organizations. I think it's about sort of stepping back and setting out key design principles. So you may have, like, brand guidelines will often have a principle approach that can then vary where it meets certain specific requirements. We do a lot of work with people like, well, I'm just thinking of, we do some work with the Met Office, for instance, and we've helped them design a design language, which is a sort of high altitude of governance that looks at the kind of principles of design, and then you can kind of apply that into a specific system that works for the responsive web setup. But equally, that same principle of design governance can then direct how you apply those designs with, let's say, iOS. And then this is about shared dependencies. And just like I said in the session today, if you're going to use a GDS design system, that is part of your design system, and that will evolve too. So you need to think, well, as they make changes and improvements, how do I learn and respond? It's the same when you're working with another system like maybe Microsoft Dynamics. There's a lot of council use that, and they will have some technical constraints that you will have to make allowances for. But I think you need principles to guide those decision making, and you probably do need a central team to help coordinate how those principles are sort of managed and how those design decisions are made.
Thank you. So we have a question here from James. He said, did you encounter resistance from organizations to implementing a new design system? And if so, how did you deal with that?
I would say in all design, you get resistance. I think it is part and parcel of the process. I think sometimes it is a way of, from a designer's perspective, I think sometimes resistance it can be related to many other factors, not your design. So it's often important to understand the context of that resistance. So sometimes it might be maybe a product owner who or a service owner who kind of just has struggled because he just hasn't had the right tools to hand to deliver the services, and it's a result, it's just a frustration. But if we can understand what their requirements are and then align them to the sort of solution so that your solution becomes a benefit, then it's really an educational process to try and turn those people around. I think equally it's about opening yourself up to all of those challenges, that sort of resistance or friction quite early on, and then working quite openly to say, well, okay, let's work together and see if we can kind of make this better. So again, that collaboration is a really good way to dissolve, I think, friction, and trying to be very, I guess, rational and principled about why and how you're making decisions. And if you make more decisions in the kind of open, and you share and disclose that process, then I think you will build trust in the process. And if people are slightly disappointed, or it's not quite going to give them the right function that they want in the right time, they have a better understanding of why decisions are made.
Brilliant, thank you. So I have a question here, kind of mentioning that, you say it's a heavy process up front. And they ask kind of how long roughly did it take the team to kind of put together kind of a basic design system that's kind of GDS aligned for one of the councils that you mentioned?
It depends on the scale of approach. I can kind of throw in 2 or 3. When we worked with Brent, the scale was quite large, and we did it under a kind of discovery, kind of GDS process discovery, and therefore actually the first part of research was quite broad, quite wide. So we looked at lots of types of services. There was quite a lot of that kind of quantitative research. But invariably, I think that was meant to be a 3 to 4 month kind of process. But the outcome meant we designed a visual sort of output of design system as a kind of head starter to feed into a digital coded design process. I think equally, we worked with Warsaw. They had a different approach. So again, different councils will cut and chop and change some of this process, but often do the same steps. With Warsaw, they had already done some research. And so we came to them, we took their research and applied it directly into a design. And again, that probably took, I think that took 3 months, but I think around about 3 months, but I think we took existing research. I think we leveraged quite a lot of our experience into those designs. So we did less usability type testing, sort of validation testing, and recommended that as a process as they built the site out. But we delivered a coded design system based on Bootstrap, which is a very kind of common design framework, but we adapted the styling, built the templates, and made it accessible within about a 3 month period. Sounds like my default answer, doesn't it? 3 months. But I guess it does depend. I mean, a piece of string in terms of how broad your research might want to go and how many types of service and specific requirements you're trying to take on board. But generally, again, a design system wants to do the most common element. So it isn't trying to resolve every job under the sun, but it's about the most common tasks. And generally for a lot of sites we've been working on with councils, it's the primary homepage. We often follow a kind of hub and spoke solution. So it's these sort of hub pages that might be waste or education that then have spokes going off. But actually what we find is that there is a fairly familiar pattern of half a dozen templates that should cover most of those. And using things like the GDS design systems gives you a kind of ready-made set of parts. So you're not trying to reinvent the wheel too much.
Thank you. Excuse me. And we've just got time for one more, actually, from James. It kind of leads on quite nice from your last question. And he was kind of asking how do you choose when to deviate from the design system guidelines, and what's your kind of design rationale for creating variants of that?
Deviate. Well, that's a really good question. A good word as well, actually. I think there is a positive friction in design in terms of what is, and I kind of raised it in the word of utility and inspire. I think it is a judgment. I think as a designer, you tend to think, well, can we read the journey and think, is a user going to think, well, now I've gone down these steps, it's feeling quite boring. But again, some processes, not to be boring, but need to be functional. So if I'm trying to fill in a form to, I don't know, get a license, then it's not about inspiring in the form. It's about when and where I do it. If it's trying to encourage people to fill in the form online rather than phone up, then I do need to inspire to sort of try and change that behavior. So I think it comes back to kind of requirements and sort of the weight of how to influence users' behaviors. So it's listening and learning. And I think it is a judgment. Again, some of this is a judgment that you get in design, but I think you validate that with your sort of service stakeholders and think, well, using their knowledge as well. So I'd sort of devolve some of the responsibility to a shared decision, but I think you get a feel, and I think we do quite a lot of sort of contextual kind of research in terms of like competitor analysis. You can see other sites and you can think, oh, that's working, that follows this system, but it lacks something, and you feel, is that the right style of service you want to create? And so sometimes those sort of elements that sort of deviate are trying to help lift the kind of experience. And I suppose that can become a subjective conversation sometimes. But you should be able to measure these things as well. So as much as a decision may be subjective, if you can measure it afterwards and it reaps the rewards, then it will validate that decision. So it wasn't just subjective, it was a sensible choice. But equally, if it doesn't work, you can learn and take stock.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Will. And yeah, thank you to everyone who tuned in today. I know there are a few questions left, but unfortunately that is all we have time for. But I'm sure if you wanted to have your question answered, you can get in touch with Will either on LinkedIn or on Twitter. Is it at Pixel Journey? Is that right?
Yeah, either would be fine. Yeah, it'd be great to hear from people.
Brilliant. Or alternatively email us at hello@nomensa.com and we can make sure that all your questions are passed on. As mentioned at the start, our next webinar is now live. That's taking place on the 28th of September, and that's titled Google is a User, Change My Mind. And that's hosted by our Senior Experience Optimization Consultant, Peter Kay. We'll be tweeting out links for you to sign up to that, and that's on our Eventbrite page. So yeah, please do sign up. That is completely free. And also, as mentioned as well, if you're interested in joining our councils and local government community to share knowledge, best practice and common challenges, please do drop us an email at hello@nomensa.com and we'll make sure you have an invite to our free virtual roundtable in November. Again, thank you to everyone that tuned in. Will, thank you very much for a brilliant presentation, and we'll see you all next month for our next webinar. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.